Hi, my name is Simone Snaith, and I'm going to read from my book Between the Water and the Woods today for the Three Rivers Library. And the book was illustrated by Sarah Kippen. Starting from chapter 1. Emmeline watched her brother Dale fling his pretend whip at his friends and then duck and spin away. She smiled, standing in the high grass with her hands on her hips, feeling the sun warm the golden bands on her forearms. Dale was spry and agile, and she felt proud of him, even though it was just a silly game that boys played, way out here on the edge of the village, as close to the moat and the woods as they dared. Her gaze was drawn to the wall of dark, tangled trees beyond the water, and her smile faded. The sight of the woods awoke an age-old fear, a primeval dread. The boys had laid a plank of roof slate across the narrowest bit of moat, where the water was only as wide as the length of 2 men. This was so the bravest ones could stand upon it, on the very edge of danger, at which point Emmeline would scream at them to get back over. So far, not one of them had risked actually crossing the water. It meandered thick and green beneath the plank, littered with lily pads and the long vines that the boys used as whips. Emmeline loved the water lilies that grew in shades of pink and white atop the water. They were like living jewels, delicate, dewy, fluttery. But now wasn't the time to start mooning over them. She was supposed to be playing the girl to be rescued, although her true role was to keep an eye on the boys. Dale was 10 and mostly level-headed, but his ragtag group of friends from all around the village were of different ages and wits. Aladane, especially, a hefty, good-looking boy with glory in his eyes, had the wildest ideas and needed extra supervision. His father, the head fisherman, was constantly apologizing for the trouble he got into. "Someone better rescue me soon," Emmeline called, sinking down into the grass. Dada would need her home shortly to help with supper. She shoved her black curls away from her eyes and laughed as a tiny blond boy called Minnow caught Aladane square in the face with his whip, then squeaked and ran away. A shout of laughter sprang up from the group. "Who let him play?" Aladane bellowed, rubbing his face. "Babies can't play lash nights." The idea that any of them were anything like real lash nights made Emmeline grin. "I don't know, Al, he's better than you," Dale said, laughing. Aladane ran after him, his heavy feet thumping on the ground. Dale dodged and weaved, and the other boys jumped into Aladane's way, waving their vine whips and sticking out their tongues. "Coward!" Aladane yelled, heaving. "A real man would stand and fight." "No, a real man learns how to cook supper for his children after their mama dies," Emmeline thought, glancing back over her shoulder toward their cottage, "and stands around fretting about what he should put in the stew to make them healthy and strong." At barely 16, she had taken on many of the household duties, but Dada tried hard not to depend on her too much. "Go and play, little Plum," he told her, using her old nickname. She had been a plump little girl and was still curvy now. "Be a child as long as you can." A cry struck Emmeline's ears and she jerked her head around. Her heart leapt into her throat. Dale was standing on the middle of the plank across the moat, waving his arms at Aladane. "Who's a coward now?" he demanded, grinning ear to ear. The sunlight gleamed off his armbands and his cropped black hair. Emmeline jumped to her feet. "Dale, get off of there!" she yelled. The other boys looked back at her and then at Aladane, who seemed frozen in place, staring at Dale. He took one step forward. "Don't you dare!" Emmeline cried and ran toward them, nearly tripping over her skirt. Aladane stepped out onto the bridge and lashed at Dale with his vine whip. Dale struck back, the two of them scooting back and forth across the slate. The other boys started cheering. "Dale Bird, get back here right now!" Emmeline shouted, reaching the end of the bridge. "It's okay, Em," Dale said, fighting. "Dada's going to kill you," she warned. "Not if you don't tell him." Emmeline felt a tug on her skirt. Minnow was at her side. "They won't go all the way over," he told her, but his small voice was worried too. A cloud crossed the sun, casting a shadow over the water and the pretend knights. Aladane suddenly tripped and fell, knocking into Dale. The bigger boy tumbled into the water with a splash, and Dale fell across onto the other side of the moat. Emmeline's heart stopped. "Dale!" she screamed. Her brother jumped up immediately, as if to run straight back across the plank, but the boys were electrified now. I dare you to stand there for 10 seconds, one shouted. Yeah, bet you can't do it. To her horror, Dale hesitated and stood there in the grass. An uncertain grin spread across his face. Then he looked down at Aladane, spluttering as he clambered up onto the slate plank. Aladane stared back at him, his eyes shining with awe. You're crazy, he said. Dale, get back here right now, Emmeline shrieked. 1, 2, 3, the boys began counting. Dale put his hands on his hips and turned around to face the dark trees. I dare you to touch a tree, one boy called. Emmeline gasped, and the others yelled, No, don't do it. This was too much. Dale looked at them over his shoulder and winked. He took one step forward, and all the boys roared. Emmeline ran out onto the plank. Aladane fell back into the water as her steps rocked the little bridge. I'm just playing, Dale said, turning around. His face was flushed. I wasn't going to do it. Emmeline reached him and grabbed his arm, and then she glanced up, unable to help herself, at the dense tangle of trunks and branches locked together a few feet away from them. Their sheer steepness alone was intimidating. The gnarled trunks rose twice as high as even the meeting hall. There were black hollows in between where no light fell. Emmeline had never seen anyone as close to the woods as she and her brother were now. A shiver shot down her spine, and her chest tightened. It's a stupid game, she snapped. Let's go. She yanked Dale by the arm and turned away. But then there was a sound. The two of them froze, and the rest of the world went quiet. A rustling. There was a rustling among the trees behind them. She turned, not breathing. A branch was trembling. Something was moving. Emmeline, Dale whispered. A shadow rose up between the twisted trunks, a shadow that moved languidly, like a snake. Boys were screaming behind them, but the voices sounded far away. Emmeline saw the silhouette of a hooded head, and then, in a finger of sunlight, something like an arm, a crooked, bent arm. It was not a human arm. Her heart beat against her like a giant fist. She whirled Dale around and shoved him straight into the moat. Then she dropped to her knees, feeling for something, anything to grab, her fingers groping into the stream, and snatched up a lily pad from the water. She turned and threw it wildly into the trees. It hit something. A terrible hiss filled her ears. She shot back across the bridge and onto the safety of the grass, grabbing hold of the slate plank's end and dragging it away from the moat. Nothing could come across now. Aladane and Dale were scrambling out of the water, pale as fish underbellies. All the boys were scattering, running for their homes. Emmeline stared back across the water at the woods. They were dark and still again, silent. What did you see? Aladane exclaimed. What did you see? Go home, Aladane, Emmeline said hoarsely. She took Dale's hand and turned away, pulling him along with her. Her teeth were chattering, her hands were shaking. She stumbled and Dale almost fell into her. Then they both broke into a run, racing ahead, leaving Aladane standing there behind them. You're a real knight, Emmeline, he cried after her. That was real. And here's Sarah Kippen's picture. It's black and white, so it might be hard to see, of the creature in the woods, and here is Emmeline and Dale at the bottom there. Okay, chapter 2. Real lash knights had not come past Equain since Emmeline was 6 years old. She had perched on a wall with Sessa as a royal procession flooded the road outside the village gates. There had been a sea of knights up high on their horses, their black armor glinting in the sun. They carried black shields with black whips coiled at their sides, and their helmets were sloped and pointed like dog muzzles. Sessa had insisted that she could see fangs. Behind the knights had chugged the steam-powered carriage that everyone knew carried King Olvend, although no one could see through its curtain-drawn windows. It was painted black and was nearly as large as a cottage, with wheels half as tall as a man, and a mound of cases strapped to its roof. Light blue and silver flags had fluttered just above the driver, their silk shining in the sun, but otherwise the black carriage and the black knights had made a dark impression. The villagers had stood solemnly in a crowd, watching them pass. That had been the king's last journey to his summer home by the ocean. He had never returned all these long years because of his wasting illness. She would never forget the sight of his steam carriage, at least. There was nothing like it in Equain, only horses, wooden bicycles, and wagons. Emmeline bit the thread she was sewing with and tied a knot, glancing over at Dale as he sat quietly in Dada's chair with a book in his lap. The light from the 2 fish oil lamps in the sitting room revealed the tension in his face. He had better start turning the pages if he wants Dada to believe he's reading. She hadn't told on him, but he was obviously shaken. Their father was sure to notice soon. A terrifying image flashed in Emmeline's mind, and she shook her head. A snake-like shadow in the trees. She would not think of it. It was gone now, and they were safe. She sewed diligently. Dada was thumping in and out of the sitting room, carrying in tools from the field and mumbling to himself. He was a tall man with straight black hair, black eyes, and a crooked nose he'd gotten from a fall in his youth. He grew vegetables in the field behind their cottage, whittled clay figures, and read every book he could get his calloused hands on. Dale had inherited his dark eyes and Emmeline his absent-minded look. Neither of them were as pale as Mama had been, but Emmeline had gotten her wildly curly black hair and filled out in her curves, which embarrassed her. The buckled-up fish leather bodices that were the fashion only emphasized it. Sessa called her podgy and scruffy. They hadn't been friends for ages, but those words still stung. Emmeline often was a bit scruffy. She spent her free time outdoors with her brother. It was fitting that Dada had not even asked questions when she and Dale came dragging in, both of them dripping wet and filthy. Dale watched Dada leave the room again and leaned forward, catching Emmeline's eye. She was startled to see the fear in his face. "It was the Ithin," he whispered. "Be quiet," she whispered back. He snapped his book closed and got up to look at the crooked shelves along the wall where Dada kept his books. She knew what he was looking for, Dada's history, which he'd pored over 100 times before. Dale pulled out the heavy tome and sat on the floor with it, flipping through the yellowed old pages. With a sigh, Emmeline put down the blouse she was mending and sat next to him. Her sewing always came out crooked anyway. Dale paused as usual at the dog-eared section about the Keldares. Mama had been one. Anyone could be if they ran off and joined them, becoming an apprentice in one of the arts they practiced. Musicians, poets, skalds, and storytellers, the Keldares traveled the kingdom, entertaining those who would listen. They went their own way and had never sworn to the king, but because of their long peaceful history, and because there were so few of them now, they were mostly left alone. Old folks whispered to each other that slivers of magic were kept alive in the realm's most ancient songs and stories that no one but the Keldares knew now. Magic ran in their blood because of it, they said. Like many Keldares, Mama had worn golden armbands, and she'd made sure that Emmeline and Dale followed the tradition, just as generations of her family had. Her people had been Keldares as far back as anyone remembered. The gold in the bands had been panned in the cold waters of the north. Dale flipped more pages until he found the section he was really looking for, the legends of dark creatures. Dark creatures, monsters that had roamed the land since the beginning of time, unnatural beasts that could only exist if magic were real. Dale's fingers swept over the ancient drawings of craggy hides, shadowed eyes, and wicked fangs. He knew all of them, and so did she. There was the bat-like Gorgon, dropping from trees to smother you with its wings. The Emble, scuttling among the undergrowth on vicious claws, never seen before it struck. The many-mouthed Stilgare, whose 100 bite was poisonous. And the Anthrane, casting alluring little lights that led you straight to its sting. Dale stopped at the Ithin, a creature wrapped in a ratty hooded cloak, stretched out along a tree branch like a snake or a giant cat. He shuddered. "Why do they wear cloaks?" he asked, his voice tight. Emmeline reached over and turned the book around. There was another drawing of an Ithin standing upright, just like a man, but its hooked arms showed through the cloak's opening. She read the text beneath it aloud. "The Ithin live in the forest and fear water, like most dark creatures. They eat the hearts of men." Dale squirmed next to her. "Some say the Ithin cover themselves in hooded cloaks because they are too hideous to behold, but it may also be a form of protection against rain, which poisons them. Few have seen their faces and lived to speak of it, but the descriptions are always the same. An elongated head with enormous round eyes, 2 large fangs in the upper jaw and 2 more in the lower, no nose or ears to speak of." Beneath the cloak is perhaps a man's form, but one not restricted by the same physical laws. Their arms are bent in the manner of the praying mantis. Dada thumped back into the room, and Emmeline jumped, almost flinging the book. Dale burst into a hysterical giggle and fell over on his back. Their father stared at them, bewildered. Then he noticed the history, so Emmeline shut it quickly and gave Dale a kick. He only laughed harder. "What in the kingdom are you two up to?" Dada asked. He was holding his pipe, which meant it was time for him to settle in for a quiet evening. The old clock that had been his father's chimed up on its shelf amid the books. "We were reading the comedies," Emmeline told him. "Dale is having a silly fit." Dada sank into his chair and shook his head, tapping his pipe. "I'm surprised he can understand them. Those old stories aren't very funny to me. I suppose humor changes with the times." He lit his pipe and watched as she stood up to slide the history back onto the shelf. "Anyway, I thought the comedies were in the back of the book," he added mildly. Emmeline cringed. She should have known he knew the book inside and out. Dada had traded with a traveler for the history book before she was born, and to this day it was his favorite. It had been a library book in the capital once, and there were several names scrawled inside the first page. First names, but no surnames, a custom of capital folk, Dada said. Dale sobered up and got to his feet. He went meekly to the divan and sat down. "Any news today, Dada?" Emmeline asked, following him. Dale had sat down on her sewing, and she yanked it out from under him. Dada blew out a cloud of smoke that smelled of sage and bay leaf. "Just more gossip about the king choosing an heir. They say he can barely walk now, the poor man." "What happens if he dies before he chooses one?" Dale asked. "He's got that brother that ran off to the outer lands, they say, Lord Erwind. I suppose they'd have to go find him." The outer lands were beyond the borders of the kingdom. People said they were barren, uncivilized, but, speaking fairly, nothing was really known of them. Emmeline had always wondered what he'd found there, if he was still alive. Why did he do that? Dale wondered. I don't know. He was supposedly some kind of genius. Their father shrugged and held out his hands. I wager he had a reason, although there's always been talk he was cast out. Maybe he had a fight with the king. I've heard Olvind has more than a streak of stubbornness in him. That's how he keeps the Theurgists at bay, with all their drama about dark magic. Mame Hindle still believes the Theurgist, Dale ventured. All the old folks do, Dada said, puffing. But the sapients have convinced 4 kings now that all magic's a trick of the eye or a natural phenomenon. Most of the time I'm inclined to agree. He paused. You know, son, there used to be one council, years and years ago, before it split into the sapients and Theurgists. Things would be a lot more peaceful if it was that way again. But what about the woods, Dada? Why are people so afraid of them? Dale asked. Emmeline gave him a look. Dada pulled his pipe out of his mouth. You stay out of the woods, he said flatly. Even without monsters, there are animals in there that would eat a little boy. Doesn't matter if they're magic or not. Yes, sir, Dale said, and pulled his legs up underneath him. The Ithin can't be natural, Emmeline thought, pulling her thread. If they were, then why would they fear water? Didn't everything natural need water to live? People certainly did. There was even a saying in the village that everyone used, bless water. Iquain had been built around 3 natural streams, and the waters ran in green canals beside the packed dirt roads. The people lived off of the crops they grew and the fish in the streams, which had been diverted to create the moat running around the 50-odd buildings of town. They were brightly painted cottages made of cob mostly, a sturdy mix of sand and mud, with slate roofs and shutters. Deep red was the most popular color, and when the sun shone on the red walls and the green water of the canals, Emmeline thought her village was truly beautiful. The moat had been created as a barrier against the woods, where wild beasts or bandits could lurk, or the dark creatures of legend. Don't go into the woods, child. Stay on this side of the water. At bedtime, Emmeline climbed the ladder up into the loft where her little room was. It was a snug triangle with the slate roof slanting down around it. Dale slept on the divan in the sitting room below, where his snores sometimes woke her out of dreams. On bad nights, she got up and yelled at him from the top of the ladder until he rolled over. Dada slept in the cottage's one true bedroom, the one he and Mama had shared. There was also a washroom with a pump that drew up water from deep in the ground. One day, Dale would grow too old for the divan, and then Emmeline would probably have to trade with him, as much as she would hate to lose her room. Would grow too tall for the divan, sorry. The loft had one window that let the stars shine in at night, and she had strung dried water lilies all around it. There were more of them floating in a bowl on a shelf. The lilies' fragile beauty thrilled her. She loved all water plants, so much so that sometimes their nearness tugged on her senses, distracting her. If she gazed at lilies long enough, colorful patterns were conjured up in her mind, dancing like light on a mirror. No one else she knew seemed to regard them much at all. She thought maybe Mama had felt that kind of love for the wind and the sky. The memories of her mother had begun to fade over the years, but she struggled to keep them close. Mama had died when Emmeline was 7, from a bad fever that had been too quick and fierce to treat. Dada had drifted around like a ghost for a whole year afterward. Emmeline remembered her pretty face and the way she had always been in motion around the house, humming. She had taken her children outdoors as much as possible, her eyes always watching the clouds. "What does that one look like, little Plum? Like a fish? And look, that one's a flower." The sweet memory faded as Emmeline stared at the flowers in her room. Without warning, the sight of them brought her back to the woods, to the lily pad she'd thrown at the thing in the trees, the languid thing in the cloak. With a shiver, Emmeline unbuckled her bodice, pulled her dress over her head, and scrambled into her round bed, drawing the covers up to her chin. It was best to forget about it. Chapter 3. Emmeline was walking to the schoolhouse to collect Dale when Sessa and 2 of her friends were suddenly upon her, circling on their bicycles. "Emmeline," Sessa exclaimed, "is it true? Did you go into the woods?" Emmeline took a step back, startled, and Sessa hopped gracefully off her bicycle. Her auburn hair was done up in a knot, and her dress was expertly embroidered with flowers and fish. The tip of her nose turned up in a very pretty way. The other 2 girls were dressed similarly, and Emmeline noticed unhappily that neither of them were stretching the buckles on their bodices. "Who told you that?" Emmeline demanded. She kept walking, and they followed her, pushing their bicycles. "We heard from Danny Fish, and he heard from Ma'am Arden, and she said that little Janin told his mama," Sessa told her in a rush. "And Olin told his mama, and she told my auntie," one of her friends declared. Emmeline sighed and looked over their heads toward the schoolhouse up ahead. It was a low, round building, the same deep red as the dress she was wearing. She could see a cluster of villagers gathering there, much larger than the usual group who came to collect their children. That was an ominous sight. Maybe the whole of Equane knew. "I didn't go in the woods," Emmeline muttered. "But you saw something in them," Sessa insisted. "A dark creature?" "I saw something," she said carefully, "but I can't be sure what it was." "Olin said you threw water at it. How are you so brave?" one of the girls asked admiringly. Emmeline shrugged, embarrassed, and Sessa harumphed as if she resented the compliment. "That was stupid," she said. "You probably made it angry. You should have just run away." "What if it comes after us now?" gasped the 3rd girl. "Don't be silly, we have the moat," Emmeline exclaimed, shouldering past them and hurrying toward the school. She could see the crowd ahead moving inward, and she had a feeling she knew exactly who was in the middle. She could hear Aladane's voice as she reached them. "There was blood on its claws," he was saying. "Red blood! I saw it!" People gasped in horror, and she caught several wide-eyed stares as she jostled forward. "Look, it's Emmeline! She was there!" someone said. She broke into the middle of the crowd in time to hear Dale protesting, "I didn't see any claws." With some relief, she saw that Teacher Ryland was standing behind him and Aladane, her large hands placed protectively on their shoulders. "You were too distracted," Aladane said hastily. "I saw its claws from the water. Big ones." He was enjoying himself, his chest puffed out. "You did not, you little liar," Emmeline cried, deflating him. "I didn't tell," Dale told her. She pulled him close to her and gave Teacher Ryland a grateful look. The teacher nodded and folded her arms. She was a tall, solemn woman who had decided in her youth to make it her place to teach all the children to read and do sums. Few of the adults in Equane knew how to read, Dada was a strong exception. So they sent along their children to learn if they could spare them. Emmeline had always liked her. "Is it true, child?" an old woman asked, peering at Emmeline. "They say you threw water at something. What did you see?" a farmer called out. "It had a hood," the boy said. "I don't know what I saw," Emmeline said stubbornly. "Was it the Ithin?" someone demanded. "I think it was," Dale murmured. "A dark creature," boomed a frightened voice. "I knew that the Urges were right." Someone else shouted, "The king must be told. We should have a meeting." Emmeline stepped back, her arms around Dale as she stared at the crowd. The villagers never got this worked up about something. Usually the only excitement was the latest gossip, or maybe an injury. This was strange, frightening. "Dark creature sightings must be reported. It's the law. Let's call a meeting." Aladane's father, Mr. Gingern, suddenly pushed his way forward and grabbed his son's shoulder with one meaty hand. He glared defiantly at the crowd, his apron covered in fish guts, and the cries died down. "All right, call your meeting then," he yelled at them, "but stop standing around stirring everybody up, making a scene over children's stories. Come on, boy." "But Dada, it's true," Aladane cried as he was dragged away. Emmeline pushed Dale ahead of her as the villagers stepped back, still chattering and whispering with one another, and the two of them wove their way through the loosening crowd. "It's absolute madness now," Emmeline hissed at Dale. "I didn't tell Em. It's not my fault." "It is your fault. You went across the moat." They hurried home to the cottage. Dada was rinsing lettuce leaves in a bucket of water, the rest of dinner laid out on the table. Grilled fish, a loaf of bread, and turnips, onions, and carrots from the fields. He looked up at them cheerfully, ready to ask how school was, but his smile hung in the air at the sight of their faces. "What is it?" he asked. "There's going to be a meeting," Emmeline told him. The meeting bell rang shortly after they finished eating, a distant but determined clangor from the hall at the center of the village. Emmeline remembered the last time she had heard it. A child had gone missing 4 years earlier, one of the Kaler brood. That was how long it had been since the villagers had needed a meeting. The poor little girl had never been found. There was talk of dark creatures then. Dada had not spoken a word when she told him what Dale had done. He had just turned pale and gone very still, and her brother had hung his head. They sat there that way for a long time before Dada finally got to his feet. He stepped over to Emmeline and laid his hand on the top of her head, a silent thank you. Then he turned and went back to making dinner without a glance at his son. Emmeline knew her brother felt the sting of it. There was no further punishment needed. Now they followed Dada through the door as the bell rang, filing out into the cool, clear evening air. Dada had dressed up in his black flat cap and a nice gray coat that buckled at the waist. Emmeline remembered him wearing them on Mama's birthday when she was little. They had borrowed horses and gone riding while a neighbor minded her and Dale. She shivered nervously as they joined the other families making their way to the meeting hall, wrapped tight in Mama's hooded red cloak. Nearly ankle length, Mama had said it was for traveling, but Emmeline never traveled and so had taken to wearing it often. Even now, its cloth held Mama's familiar scent of basil, ginger, and clove pinks. Was it true that the king must be told about this? How? Would they send him a letter? Once a month, a post wagon came to the village gates with letters from faraway relatives, and packages of glass and metal ordered from the catalogs it carried. This was also how they paid the meager taxes they owed to the king, each household wrapping up a small portion of goods and handing them off to the driver. He often had news from the capital, and sometimes he carried formal notices announcing new laws that had been passed. But as far as she knew, no one in Aquain wrote letters to the king himself. The village was so insignificant, she was not even sure the post would deliver it. A tall boy stood atop the meeting hall's domed roof, pulling the rope that rang the great bell. Emmeline covered her ears as the clanging blasted over their heads. A steady stream of people was crowding in through the double doors of the hall. It was a big building with a raised ceiling that caused voices to echo, which seemed to give them more importance. The cob walls had been painted white and built with rows of windows to ensure that the villagers couldn't be ambushed when they were all amassed in one place. Ambushed by what, she had never been sure. Someone waved at Emmeline. It was Indrina, the baker's daughter, her best friend in the village. She waved back as Dada hurried her through the aisles to a seat. Next to Emmeline, Dale gazed around with wide eyes at the buzzing, murmuring people. Most people had dressed up for the meeting, which meant there were more hats, cowls, buckles, and bread and flour chaplets than Emmeline had seen, bead and flour chaplets than Emmeline had seen in ages. She rarely saw so many villagers together, except maybe at the market. "You think they're going to make me speak?" Dale asked Emmeline in a whisper. She shrugged, but she'd been wondering the same thing. The bell finally ceased overhead. Old Mr. Hindley had the honor of leading the meetings, but he was likely to pass it down to his grown son, Alvin, soon, considering how old and weak of voice he was now. It took several long moments before the villagers realized he was calling out for them to quiet down. Then they hushed each other and settled in their seats expectantly. "Thank you all for coming," old Hindley wheezed. Emmeline craned her neck for a sight of him as the voices died down around her. Bent back and white-haired, he was standing precariously on a chair at the front of the hall, wearing an ancient pair of spectacles and holding a flattened brown hat in his veiny hands. The wall behind him was covered in a giant tapestry that had been woven in the early days of Equine. It was a map of the entire kingdom, like the ones in the history. Large, elaborate fish oil lamps graced the wall on either side of it, and the embroidered land and water seemed to shift in their flickering light. The capital was marked with a red star in the center of the northwest, Equine with a tiny blue star down in the southeastern corner. Old Hindley was not a man to waste words. "Unless you've been under a rock today, then I suppose you've heard the news that a dark creature may have been sighted by 2 children," he announced. "Now, there's no cause for alarm since we are still protected by our moat. As I understand it, this took place on the wrong side of the water, where no one should have been anyway." Emmeline saw Dada glance across her at Dale, who cringed. "Well, we haven't had a sighting on record since the moat was built, so it bears some looking into." Mr. Hindley straightened up as much as he could and peered out over the crowd. "Where are the 2 witnesses?" All the heads in the hall turned toward Emmeline and Dale. Dada stood and stepped aside to let her and Dale walk out from their row. Emmeline straightened up, breathed deep, and squared her shoulders. She took her brother's hand and led the way past the ranks of staring eyes, all the way up to the front of the hall, where Mr. Hindley stood waiting. He climbed down stiffly from his chair and nodded at them. "Tell us what happened, Hart," he told her kindly. She faced the crowd with her hands in her dress pockets, feeling very awkward, and looked for somewhere to fix her eyes. In the middle of the front row sat Mr. Fish, which was unfair of him as one of the tallest men in the village. He was square-jawed and broad-shouldered, with kind, blunt features and curly brown hair, and his 2 nearly grown sons sat next to him, looking just like younger Mr. Fish's. One of them winked at her. She colored, suddenly finding her voice. "The boys were playing lash nights near the moat behind the mill. You know, they pull vines out of the water and use them as whips. Anyway, they put a slate plank across the water just to show off, and then Dale ran across it." Her voice turned sharp despite herself. Sounds of shock and disapproval sprang up from the crowd. When she glanced down at her brother, his mouth had collapsed into a pitiful frown. She put her arm around him, softening. "They stir each other up, him and some of the others. There was no reason to get Aladane in further trouble. I ran after him and was pulling him back, but then we heard something in the woods." Silence fell around the room. Her heart beat faster, hot in her chest. "And then I looked. It was hard to see what it was." "It was moving," Dale spoke up. "Like an animal?" old Hindley asked. "Well, its head was about this high," Emmeline said, raising her arm high above her own head. "Standing like a man." "Yes, but not moving like one." She bit her lip. "And it did look like it wore a hood." Cries and gasps exploded from the crowd. Some even sprang to their feet. "The Ithin! I knew it, bless water! Ithin! They eat human hearts! They'll tear it right out of your chest!" Old Hindley got up on his chair again, waving his arms for silence. Emmeline gripped Dale's hand and took a step back, straining to look for Dada, but she couldn't find him. "The theurgists are right!" someone shouted. Several others took up the call, while many more cried out aghast. Old Hindley's mouth was moving, calling for order, but his voice was drowned out. No one was paying him any attention. This was worse than outside the school. Suddenly, Emmeline pictured Mama whistling out to Dada in the fields. Her whistle had been sharper and clearer than glass. She put 2 fingers in her mouth and blew. The piercing sound broke through the clamor, and not a few people jumped, startled. Then they all went quiet, staring up at her. Dale grinned. He knew that whistle. "All right, let's have a civil discussion," old Henley rasped into the silence. "Everyone take your seats." He gave them a moment to settle themselves. "All right, now remember, we don't have solid evidence. All we've got is something spotted by a pair of children. We shouldn't get carried away now. You forgot about the lily pad," Dale piped up. There were sounds of agreement from those who had heard the gossip. "That's right, I pulled a lily pad out of the moat and threw it into the trees," Emmeline admitted. "And then I heard something hiss." The clamor rose up again instantly. "They're afraid of water! I knew it! The stories are true! Brave girl, that one!" Old Henley managed to catch their attention this time, but even as they dropped their voices, they stared at Emmeline. Embarrassed, she saw Fish's son, the one who had winked, turning to grin at his brother. "Protected the little ones. That's a good woman," he said, just loudly enough. She blushed furiously and stared at the floor. "Well, that is certainly more suspicious," old Henley admitted to the crowd. He stood there for a moment on his chair, scratching his chin. "I suppose we'd best take suggestions on how to proceed." More than half of the villagers shot their hands up at once. The old man sighed and waved a hand at Emmeline and Dale. "You children better have a seat," he told them. "We'll be here a while." Thank you very much.